In the summer of 1957, the quiet congregation of Millbrook Baptist Church in rural Alabama was unsettled by the vanishing of 8-year-old Lucy Parker. She had disappeared without a trace during the annual church picnic, leaving behind only her torn Sunday dress near the cemetery wall. But 22 years later, when Pastor David Chen stumbles upon a hidden chamber beneath the church, he uncovers a truth so horrifying it would unravel the very fabric of the community's faith and lead to the most chilling revelation imaginable. The afternoon sun blazed merciless and white above the church grounds that July day, casting sharp shadows between the towering oak trees, where families had spread their checkered blankets. The air hung thick with the scent of fried chicken and sweet tea, punctuated by the laughter of children playing tag among the weathered headstones of the adjacent cemetery. Lucy Parker moved like a bright butterfly through the crowd, her pink gingham dress, crisp with starch-white ankle socks, pristine despite the red Alabama clay that clung to everything else. She had been the star of that morning service, her clear soprano voice lifting the congregation during "How Great Thou Art." Now she wove between the adults with a paper plate balanced carefully in her small hands, her dark curls bouncing with each step. Her mother, Sarah Parker, watched from beneath the shade of the fellowship hall's overhang, fanning herself with a church bulletin while discussing the upcoming harvest festival with the other ladies. "Lucy, honey, don't go too far," Sarah called. But her daughter was already disappearing behind the massive trunk of the cemetery's oldest oak, chasing fireflies that had begun their early evening dance despite the lingering daylight. That was the last time anyone saw Lucy Parker alive. When the sun began its descent toward the tree line and the family started packing their baskets, Sarah's voice cut through the pleasant chatter like a blade. "Lucy, Lucy." The name echoed off the church's white clapboard walls, bounced between the headstones, and seemed to disappear into the kudzu-choked woods beyond. They found her dress an hour later, torn and muddy, caught on the rusted iron spikes that topped the cemetery's crumbling stone wall. The fabric fluttered in the evening breeze like a surrender flag, while somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill began its mournful call. By dawn, the next morning, every able-bodied man in Millbrook had joined the search. They moved through the woods in careful lines, calling Lucy's name until their voices grew hoarse. Sheriff's deputies arrived from the county seat, their patrol cars kicking up clouds of dust on the unpaved church road. But it was Detective Ray Morrison who stepped out of the unmarked sedan. His weathered face already grim with the knowledge that torn dresses rarely led to happy endings. Morrison had seen too many cases like this during his 15 years with the state police. The methodical way he surveyed the scene spoke of experience with the worst humanity had to offer. His grey eyes took in every detail: the angle of the fabric on the cemetery wall, the trampled grass around the oak tree, the way the other searchers had already contaminated potential evidence in their desperate urgency. "Detective Morrison," a soft voice interrupted his examination. Morrison turned to find a thin man in his 40s approaching, wearing a pressed white shirt despite the early hour. Round spectacles perched on a narrow nose, and his thinning brown hair was combed with mathematical precision. "I'm Harold Finch, church treasurer. Pastor Williams asked me to assist you in any way possible." Morrison studied the man's earnest face. Finch held a leather-bound ledger against his chest like a shield, his pale hands gripping it with careful reverence. "I've brought all our membership records, attendance logs, even the financial books. I know every family in this congregation, detective. Every soul who was here yesterday." "That's helpful, Mr. Finch. I'll need to interview everyone who attended the picnic." Morrison pulled out his notebook, its pages already damp with morning humidity. "Starting with anyone who might have interacted with Lucy." Harold nodded solemnly, pushing his spectacles higher on his nose. "Of course, I've already compiled a preliminary list." He opened the ledger with practiced efficiency, revealing pages of neat handwriting in black ink. "Lucy was well loved here, Detective. A true angel of God, but—" He hesitated, glancing toward the cemetery wall, where Lucy's dress still hung like an accusation. "But what, Mr. Finch? Well, not everyone was as fond of her special place in our church family. Some adults can be petty about a child receiving attention they feel they deserve." Harold's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I hate to speak ill of anyone, but there were tensions, jealousies even." Morrison's pen hovered over his notebook. "I'll need names." Harold's fingers traced down the ledger pages with practiced precision. "Martha Wells, our choir director. She's been difficult lately. Lucy's solo performances have overshadowed Martha's own ambitions for recognition." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "Then there's Silas Burke, the gravedigger. He lives alone in that old cabin past the woods. People talk about strange lights at night, odd symbols carved in trees near his property." Morrison scribbled notes, his pen scratching against the humid paper. Around them, the search party's voices grew more distant as they expanded their perimeter into the deeper woods. "Anyone else?" "Eleanor Parker, Lucy's aunt." Harold's voice dropped even lower. "She's had episodes, Detective. The family tries to keep it quiet, but she's been hospitalized twice for mental disturbances. Sarah Parker confided in me once about Eleanor's fixation on Lucy, how she claimed the child was chosen for something special." The words hung in the oppressive morning air like smoke. Morrison looked up from his notebook to find Harold watching him with those pale, earnest eyes. Something flickered across the treasurer's face. Concern, perhaps. Or was it something else? The expression vanished so quickly, Morrison wondered if he'd imagined it. "You keep detailed records," Morrison observed, nodding toward the ledger. "The Lord's work requires precision," Harold replied, his thin lips forming what might have been a smile. "I've recorded every donation, every attendance, every church event for the past 12 years. Even noted behavioral patterns among the congregation. It helps Pastor Williams know who might need extra pastoral care." He opened to another section, revealing columns of neat observations. "Martha missed 3 Sundays after Lucy's Easter solo. Eleanor has been attending evening services alone, always sitting in the back pew, always watching Lucy during children's choir practice." Morrison felt a chill, despite the climbing temperature. The man's thoroughness was either admirably dedicated or deeply unsettling. "And Silas Burke hasn't attended regular services in months, but I've seen him lurking around the cemetery during evening vespers. Claims he's checking on recent burials, but—" Harold shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken accusations. "I document everything, Detective. The church is God's house, and someone must keep watch over his flock." In the distance, a search dog began barking frantically near the creek. Both men turned toward the sound, but it faded into nothing. Another false hope in what was becoming a nightmare without end. Martha Wells lived in a yellow clapboard house 3 blocks from the church, its front porch sagging under the weight of neglect and bitter disappointment. When Morrison knocked on her screen door that afternoon, the sound echoed hollow through rooms that smelled of stale coffee and something darker, the acrid scent of dreams curdled by time. She answered wearing a faded house dress, her greying hair pinned back with bobby pins that had lost their grip. Martha had been beautiful once. Morrison could see it in the bones of her face, the elegant line of her neck. But 43 years of small-town life had carved deep lines around her mouth, and her eyes held the particular hardness of someone who had watched younger, prettier voices steal what she believed was rightfully hers. "Detective Morrison!" Her voice carried the trained projection of a choir director, each syllable carefully enunciated. "I suppose this is about poor little Lucy." Morrison settled into a worn armchair that wheezed under his weight. The living room felt like a shrine to musical ambitions, never quite realized, sheet music stacked on every surface, a piano bench loaded with hymnal arrangements, framed certificates from long-ago vocal competitions, yellow with age. "I understand you directed the children's choir." "I direct all the choirs." The correction came sharp and quick. "Adult, youth and children's. 22 years of faithful service to Millbrook Baptist." Martha's fingers worried at the lace doily on her chair arm. "Though I suppose my contributions don't matter much when an 8-year-old can turn the congregation's heads with a few pretty notes." Morrison watched her carefully. Lucy had a special voice. Special. Martha spat the word like it tasted bitter. "That's what everyone said. That child hadn't learned proper breath control, couldn't read music worth a damn, but she could stand up there and make grown men weep with 'How great thou art.'" Her hands clenched into fists. "Do you know how long I practiced that solo? How many years I waited for Pastor Williams to choose me for the Easter cantata?" The afternoon light, streaming through her windows, illuminated dust motes that danced like tiny spectres around Martha's head. Morrison noticed a church bulletin pinned to her refrigerator, Lucy's name circled in red ink next to the Sunday service lineup. Below it, someone had written in careful script, "The child receives what the woman has earned." "You sound angry, Miss Wells." "Angry?" Martha laughed, but there was no humour in the sound. "Detective, I gave my life to that church. My voice, my time, my devotion. And Harold Finch's precious little records will show perfect attendance for over 2 decades. But none of that matters when a pretty child bats her eyelashes and opens her mouth." Silas Burke's cabin squatted at the end of a rutted dirt road like something that had crawled out of the Alabama woods to die. Morrison's patrol car bounced through potholes filled with stagnant rainwater where mosquitoes bred in lazy clouds above the murky surface. The detective had driven out here based on Harold Finch's careful documentation. The treasurer had noted Silas's increasingly erratic behaviour in his meticulous records, including several instances of the gravedigger being seen near the church grounds after midnight. The cabin itself seemed to lean away from the world, its unpainted boards weathered to the colour of old bone. A vegetable garden struggled behind chicken wire, though the plants looked sickly and strange herbs Morrison didn't recognise twisted around wooden stakes, carved with symbols that made his skin crawl. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very atmosphere was tainted with something unnatural. Silas answered the door on the third knock, his massive frame filling the doorway. Years of digging graves had carved his body into something elemental. Broad shoulders, hands like shovels, forearms corded with muscle, and crisscrossed with old scars. His black hair hung lank past his shoulders, and his dark eyes held the kind of wildness Morrison associated with animals caught in traps. "You're here about the girl," Silas said. His voice rumbled from somewhere deep in his chest, like gravel shifting in a quarry. Morrison pushed past him into the cabin's single room. What he saw there confirmed every whispered suspicion the townspeople had shared. Books lined makeshift shelves, not the leather-bound classics you'd expect from a simple gravedigger, but volumes with titles that seemed to writhe in the dim light. The Lesser Key of Solomon, Blood Rituals of the Old Ways, Summoning the Dark. Candle wax pooled on every surface in grotesque formations, and something that looked disturbingly like an altar occupied the cabin's far corner. "People talk," Morrison said, running his finger along the spine of a particularly disturbing tome. The leather felt wrong somehow, too soft, too warm. "People fear what they don't understand." Silas moved to the window, his massive silhouette blocking what little light filtered through the dirty glass. But Harold Finch understands. He's been asking questions about my work about the old ways. Curious man for a church treasurer. Morrison looked up sharply. Harold Finch has been here. Couple times, always after dark, always alone. Silas's laugh was like distant thunder. Said he wanted to learn about protecting the church from evil influences. Morrison's pen stilled against his notebook. The revelation hung in the stifling air between them like a question mark made of smoke. What kind of questions was Mr. Finch asking? Silas turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the cabin's perpetual twilight. Said there were dark forces at work in the congregation. Wanted to know about protective symbols, about cleansing rituals. The big man's scarred hands gestured toward his collection of occult books. Most folk cross the street when they see me coming, but Harold, he seemed genuinely interested in the old knowledge. The detective's attention was drawn to something glinting in the corner. A small glass vial filled with what looked like hair dark and fine, tied with a pink ribbon. Morrison's stomach tightened. "What's that? Protection charm," Silas said too quickly. "For warding off evil." But Morrison was already moving toward the altar, his trained eye cataloguing details that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Beside the vial sat a collection of children's drawings, the kind proudly displayed on church bulletin boards during vacation Bible school. All featured the same subject, a little girl with dark curls rendered in crayon with the innocent skill of young hands. Lucy's name appeared in careful block letters at the bottom of each one. Where did you get these? Silas's massive frame seemed to shrink. Found them. People throw away all kinds of things behind the church. Seemed wrong to let drawings of an angel go to waste. The air in the cabin felt thick enough to choke on. Morrison noticed other disturbing details. Chicken bones arranged in precise patterns, a calendar with yesterday's date circled in red and scratched into the wooden wall beside the altar, a crude pentagram that matched the symbol Harold Finch had described from his late-night conversations with this strange man. "The girl who disappeared," Morrison said carefully. "Did you see her at the picnic?" "Saw her singing that morning, voice like silver bells." Silas's eyes took on a distant quality. "Some voices are too pure for this world, detective. Sometimes they have to be preserved." Outside, a crow cawed from the diseased oak tree that leaned over Silas's cabin like a black umbrella. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the room. Silas blinked, focusing on Morrison again with something that might have been surprise, as if he'd forgotten the detective was there. "I didn't hurt that child," he said finally. "But something evil walks among the faithful. Harold Finch knows it too. That's why he came asking about protection." Eleanor Parker lived in a narrow two-story house on Magnolia Street, its windows perpetually shuttered, as if the woman inside feared what daylight might reveal. Morrison found her in the back garden when he arrived that evening, kneeling among the tomato plants with dirt-stained hands and eyes that seemed to focus on something far beyond the visible world. She was Sarah Parker's younger sister, but the years had not been kind. Where Sarah maintained the careful composure of a proper church lady, Eleanor's 40-year-old face showed the ravages of minds that had been broken and badly mended. Her greying hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she wore the same blue dress Morrison had seen her in at the picnic, now wrinkled and stained with garden soil. "She's not dead," Eleanor said without looking up from the tomatoes. Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who lived in a reality adjacent to everyone else's. "Lucy's somewhere special, somewhere safe. I told Harold that when he came asking questions." Morrison's notebook snapped open. "Harold Finch was here. Yesterday morning before church. Said he was concerned about my mental state, after Lucy's disappearance. Eleanor's laugh was brittle as autumn leaves. Funny thing for a treasurer to worry about, don't you think? But Harold's always been attentive to the needs of the congregation. She finally looked up, and Morrison saw something in her pale eyes that made his skin crawl, a mixture of grief and anticipation, as if she was waiting for something wonderful and terrible to happen. He asked me about my episodes, about what the doctors said during my stays at the state hospital. Morrison knew about those hospitalizations from the preliminary reports. Eleanor had been committed twice in the past 5 years, once for claiming she could hear dead children singing in the church cemetery, and again for attempting to baptize neighborhood cats in the name of purification. Both times she'd been released after brief stays and heavy medication. What did you tell Mr. Finch? The truth. Eleanor's hands worked unconsciously in the dirt, her fingers tracing patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I told him about the dreams, about the voice that calls to me from beneath the church, about how Lucy was marked from birth for something greater than this world. The garden around them felt unnaturally quiet. Even the crickets that should have been singing their evening chorus were silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Morrison noticed that Eleanor's hands had drawn symbols in the loose earth circles, within circles lines that intersected at strange angles. Marked how? The way she sang, the way light seemed to follow her. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. Harold understands. He's been keeping records of the chosen ones for years. That night, Morrison returned to the church to find Harold Finch waiting in the fellowship hall, his ledger spread across a folding table like a battle plan. Electric bulbs cast harsh shadows across the treasurer's pale features as he hunched over pages of meticulous handwriting, occasionally making notations with a fountain pen that scratched against the paper like fingernails on glass. "Detective, I've been expecting you." Harold looked up through his wire-rimmed spectacles, his thin lips forming that peculiar smile again. "I've compiled additional information about our 3 primary suspects, cross-referenced with attendance patterns and behavioral observations." Morrison settled into a metal chair that scraped against the linoleum floor. The fellowship hall felt different at night, larger somehow, its corners swimming in shadows that seemed to breathe with their own life. Through the windows he could see the cemetery's weathered headstones, standing like broken teeth against the star-scattered sky. "You've been thorough," Morrison observed, studying the treasurer's elaborate charts and timelines. Harold had documented everything: Martha's increasing bitterness, Silas's strange nocturnal activities, Eleanor's mental deterioration. But more than that, he'd noted details that seemed almost intimate. Personal conversations overheard private struggles, witnessed secrets that should have remained hidden. "The Lord's work requires vigilance," Harold replied, turning a page to reveal what looked like a family tree, with Lucy's name at the centre, surrounded by connecting lines to various church members. "I've been particularly concerned about Eleanor Parker's influence on the child. Did you know she visited Lucy every Tuesday after school? Always brought little gifts, hair ribbons, picture books, sometimes candies shaped like angels." Morrison frowned. "How do you know that?" "I live in the apartment above Henley's grocery store. Perfect view of the Parker house." Harold's finger traced a line on his chart. "I keep regular observations of congregational interactions. For pastoral care purposes, you understand. Pastor Williams relies on my reports to know which families might need extra attention." The treasurer opened another section of his ledger, revealing detailed floor plans of the church building. "I've also been considering access points. All 3 suspects had keys to various church areas. Martha has the choir room and sanctuary keys. Silas has access to the crypt and basement for maintenance. And Eleanor..." Harold paused, his pen hovering over the page. "Eleanor had a key to the old storage rooms. Her late husband was head deacon before his death 3 years ago. You seem to know a great deal about everyone's movements." Harold's pale eyes reflected the harsh, fluorescent light. "Someone has to watch over God's house, detective. Someone has to remember everything." The investigation consumed 3 more weeks before it finally crumbled under the weight of circumstantial evidence and small-town secrets. Martha Wells had an alibi. She'd been helping serve lemonade in full view of a dozen witnesses when Lucy disappeared. Silas Burke's strange collection proved to be nothing more than the eccentric hobby of a lonely man who read too much and understood too little. Eleanor Parker's mental fragility made her a tragic figure, but the timeline of her movements that day placed her nowhere near the cemetery when Lucy vanished. Harold Finch's detailed records became the investigation's backbone and its curse. Every lead the treasurer provided led to dead ends wrapped in reasonable explanations. His helpful suggestions guided Morrison away from productive avenues and toward the dramatic shadows of obvious suspects. When the state police finally suspended active investigation in August 1957, Harold was the last person to speak with Detective Morrison, offering condolences and assuring him that the church would never stop praying for Lucy's safe return. The years passed like pages turning in Harold's meticulous ledgers. Martha Wells eventually left Millbrook, taking a position with a church choir in Birmingham. Silas Burke grew older and stranger, his cabin gradually swallowed by kudzu and local legend. Eleanor Parker spent her final years in gentle madness tending a garden where she claimed to hear Lucy's voice carried on the evening wind. She died in 1974, taking whatever secret she harbored to a grave that Silas dug with unusual care. Harold Finch remained. He attended every service, kept every record, and maintained his quiet vigilance over the congregation with the dedication of a man performing sacred duty. Pastor Williams retired in 1978, and the church board began searching for new leadership to guide them into the coming decade. They found David Chen in a small Methodist seminary in Georgia, a young pastor with earnest eyes and a desire to serve rural communities that larger churches had forgotten. When he arrived in Millbrook during the humid summer of 1979, Harold was among the first to greet him, carrying the same leather ledger he'd maintained for over 2 decades. "Welcome to our fellowship, Pastor Chen," Harold said, shaking the younger man's hand with his characteristic soft grip. "I've prepared detailed histories of our congregation, our building, and our community. 22 years of faithful record-keeping, all at your disposal." Pastor Chen accepted the files with gratitude, unaware that within those careful pages lay the architecture of a decades-old deception, and that the helpful man who'd compiled them was about to face the one thing he'd never planned for discovery. Pastor Chen proved to be a methodical man with a passion for understanding every aspect of his new ministry. Unlike his predecessor, who had been content to let Harold Finch manage the church's practical affairs, Chen insisted on personally inspecting every room, every storage area, every forgotten corner of the building that had served Millbrook Baptist for over a century. "I like to know my church intimately," he explained to Harold as they toured the basement storage areas on a sweltering August morning. "A pastor should be familiar with every inch of God's house." Harold walked beside him with apparent enthusiasm, his ledger tucked under one arm as he pointed out various features and historical details. But Chen noticed something odd whenever they approached certain areas, particularly the oldest sections near the original foundation. Harold seemed to develop an urgent need to show him something else, a water stain that required immediate attention, an electrical issue that demanded careful explanation, small diversions that felt almost choreographed. "What's behind this door?" Chen asked, stopping before a heavy wooden barrier near the church's eastern wall. The door was older than the others, its iron hinges black with age and use. Strange symbols had been carved into the wood-crude marks that Harold quickly dismissed as old Methodist decorations from when they built this section. Just storage, Harold said, his voice carrying a slight tension Chen hadn't heard before. Mostly empty. Pastor Williams and I cleaned it out years ago, nothing but dust and spider webs now. But Chen's curiosity was stronger than Harold's deflections. He tried the handle and found it locked. "Do you have the key?" Harold patted his pockets with theatrical confusion. "I'm afraid I left the key ring in my office. Perhaps we could return to that area another day. There's still so much of the main building to cover." 3 days later, Chen returned alone with a maintenance worker who helped him force the warped door open. The room beyond exhaled air that tasted of decades-old secrets. And something else, something sweet and corrupt that made Chen's stomach clench with revulsion. His flashlight beam swept across stone walls that predated the church above, revealing a chamber that seemed to belong to a different kind of worship entirely. A pentagram had been carved deep into the floor's center, its lines still dark with what looked suspiciously like old blood. Melted candles formed grotesque sculptures on makeshift altars, their wax pooled in patterns that suggested careful, repeated use. But it was the small object pinned to the far wall that made Chen's breath catch in his throat. A child's hair, bow pink gingham fabric, now faded to the color of old bone, secured with a single rusted nail like some terrible trophy. Beneath it, scratched into the stone in Harold Finch's precise handwriting, were the words, "Lucy Parker, offered August 3rd, 1957, the first of many." Pastor Chen's phone call reached Detective Morrison at his home in Montgomery, where the now 57-year-old investigator had been trying to forget the cases that never closed. 22 years had silvered Morrison's hair and carved deeper lines around his eyes, but Lucy Parker's disappearance remained a wound that had never properly healed. When Chen described what he'd found beneath the church, Morrison felt the familiar weight of unfinished business settle back onto his shoulders like an old, unwelcome coat. He arrived in Millbrook the next morning with a forensics team and a heart full of bitter hope. The hidden chamber looked even more sinister in the harsh glare of police floodlights. The carved pentagram seemed to writhe in the shifting shadows, and the melted candles cast grotesque shapes on walls that had witnessed unspeakable acts. But it was Lucy's hair bow that broke something inside Morrison's chest, the faded pink fabric, a reminder of innocence destroyed by evil that had masqueraded as righteousness. "We'll need to process everything," Morrison told the forensics photographer, his voice hoarse with emotion he thought he'd buried decades ago. "Every surface, every object. This bastard was careful, but 22 years is a long time to keep secrets." As the team methodically documented the chamber, Morrison's attention was drawn to something the initial discovery had missed, a slim volume wedged between two loose stones in the eastern wall. He extracted it carefully, recognizing immediately what it was, a church hymnbook, its red leather cover worn smooth by countless hands during Sunday services. The book fell open to "How Great Thou Art," and Morrison's breath caught. Faint pencil marks covered the margins of the page, not the usual annotations of a devoted worshipper, but something far more disturbing. Numbers and dates formed careful columns beside the hymn's verses, times and locations. Names written in a handwriting so precise it looked almost mechanical. Lucy Parker, July 28, 1957, morning rehearsal, voice quality assessment. Read one entry, another. Subject shows no fear of isolated areas, trusting nature confirmed, optimal for approach. Morrison's hands began to tremble as he turned the pages. More hymns, more annotations. A methodical cataloguing of a child's habits, movements, vulnerabilities. The handwriting was maddeningly familiar. He'd seen it before, had relied on it during the original investigation. Those careful letters, the precise formation of each character, the mechanical perfection that had seemed so trustworthy 22 years ago. The hymn book contained planning notes for what had happened to Lucy Parker. Not the impulsive act of a disturbed stranger, but the calculated preparations of someone who had studied her like a scientist, observing a specimen, someone who had access to her routines, her schedule, her innocent trust in the adults who guided her spiritual life. Morrison closed his eyes, fighting against the recognition that was clawing its way toward the surface of his consciousness. The handwriting analysis took only 3 hours to confirm what Morrison's gut had been screaming since he'd opened that hymnal. The precise script in the margins matched perfectly with Harold Finch's meticulous church records, every loop of every letter, every careful formation of numbers, every mechanical perfection that had seemed so admirable during the original investigation. Morrison sat in his rental car outside Harold's apartment above Henley's grocery store, watching the yellow light in the upstairs window and feeling 22 years of carefully constructed assumptions crumble around him. The helpful church treasurer, who had provided such detailed records, who had guided every aspect of the investigation, who had seemed so concerned about finding Lucy's killer, had been the killer himself. The realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. Every lead Harold had provided had been designed to eliminate himself as a suspect while casting suspicion on convenient targets. The detailed observations about Martha's jealousy, Silas's occult interests, Eleanor's mental instability, all carefully crafted misdirection from a man who understood that the best place to hide was in plain sight, offering help to those trying to find him. When Morrison climbed the narrow stairs to Harold's apartment, he found the door unlocked. Harold sat at a small kitchen table, still wearing his pressed white shirt and wire-rimmed spectacles, his hands folded over that familiar leather ledger. He looked up as Morrison entered, and for the first time in 2 decades, the treasurer's pale eyes held something other than helpful concern. "I've been expecting you," Harold said quietly. His voice carried the same measured tone it always had, but now Morrison heard the coldness underneath the clinical detachment of someone who viewed other human beings as objects to be catalogued and used. I suppose Pastor Chen's curiosity finally got the better of him. Morrison's hand rested on his service weapon, though some part of him couldn't quite believe he was facing down the soft-spoken man who had been so helpful during those desperate weeks in 1957. Why Harold? She was just a child. Harold opened his ledger, turning to a page Morrison had never seen before. It contained detailed drawings of the hidden chamber architectural plans showing how to access it from the church basement, and most chilling of all, a list of other names, children from the congregation, with careful notations about their suitability for future offerings. Lucy wasn't the first, Harold said, with matter-of-fact precision. She was simply the most perfect. That voice, that innocent trust, that pure spirit, she was exactly what the old gods required for proper communion. His fingers traced over her name in the ledger. The chamber beneath the church has been used for such purposes for over a century. I'm merely the latest caretaker of an ancient tradition. The apartment felt smaller. Suddenly the walls pressing in as Morrison realized he was standing in the presence of something far worse than a simple murderer. Harold's confession came in the same measured tone he'd used to provide helpful information during the original investigation. He described Lucy's final moments with clinical precision, how he'd lured her to the hidden chamber with promises of showing her special church secrets, how her trust had never wavered even as he prepared the ritual circle, how her voice had echoed off the stone walls one last time before the old gods claimed their offering. She didn't suffer, Harold said, as if this detail somehow mitigated the horror. The ritual requires a willing spirit detective, Lucy believed she was participating in something sacred right until the end. Morrison's hands shook as he placed Harold under arrest, reading rights to a man who had spent 22 years guiding an investigation into his own crime. The ledger contained evidence of Harold's plans for other children. Careful observations about which young voices in the choir might serve as future offerings, detailed notes about building trust with families who saw him as nothing more than a devoted church treasurer. The arrest sent shockwaves through Millbrook that reverberated for months. Church attendance dropped to almost nothing as congregants struggled to understand how evil had hidden so perfectly among them. Pastor Chen worked tirelessly to rebuild not just faith in God, but faith in the ability to recognize goodness from deception. He ordered the hidden chamber sealed permanently, then blessed as if holy words could somehow purify stone that had witnessed such darkness. Harold Finch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no remorse during the trial, maintaining that he had served a higher purpose than human law could understand. He died in his cell 3 years later, taking to his grave the locations of other victims whose names had appeared in his terrible ledger. As the years passed, Millbrook slowly began to heal. Pastor Chen found the church's attendance gradually returning as families decided that faith was stronger than the evil that had tried to destroy it. Sarah Parker, now silver-haired and bent with grief, finally had answers to the questions that had haunted her for over 2 decades. As they gathered for Lucy's memorial service in 1983, the congregation looked at the simple wooden cross Pastor Chen had installed, where the cemetery wall once stood. Sarah Parker squeezed her surviving daughter's hand. "I thought I'd never find peace," she whispered. "But maybe now we can begin to heal." "Lucy would want us to keep singing," her daughter replied softly. They stepped toward a healing, toward a future they would build one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.